Okay, I'm going to start off with a test. Here is a morality test. You are working for a large corporation, you've been working your way up over the years, and you see you could actually become the head of this, for this job, for this corporation. But there's somebody in competition with you, and you realize there would be a way to undermine them so that you could for sure get the top job. Well, here's even maybe a better option, so to speak. Better, it's actually worse, but anyway. Here's another option that would be better for your ability to achieve. In that, let's say you are in competition with this great job, and you hear that someone else is going to come against your competition against that person. And they're going to try to take them out. But you're all aware of the plan, so you can say nothing and let it happen. You can get the position. Or do you say something? Do you protect that kind of person? So today we're talking about character. How important is character? What does God think about character? What do we think about character? Is this kind of characteristics important for us to have character and righteousness? Today I want to talk about a real hero of mine. And I don't think I've hardly ever heard a Sunday school lesson on this person. There's not that many teachings, maybe. He doesn't stand out as a hero. I don't think he's even mentioned as a hero in the hero chapter of chapter 11 of Hebrews, but he's a real hero. So his character, his faith, his integrity is outstanding. And he is a man that had that kind of opportunity to really get to the top, but he didn't choose it. How many shows have there been made on TV? How many people have worked in offices like that, where shows sometimes reflect reality, where people have undermined other people to climb the ladder? They'll climb over other people, you know? In history, it's replete with so many people that have fought and killed others to take the throne, right? Herod tops the list of bad boys doing that kind of thing. Herod killed his 3 sons out of fear that they might usurp and take his throne. In fact, we remember Herod went and killed all the children from 2 under, because they heard the Messiah might be being born, and he was trying to eliminate the Messiah. Herod even killed his own wife. He killed his own mother-in-law. He killed his brother-in-law. He killed so many of his own family members just because he wanted to make sure he remained king. What kind of character is that? That's an outstanding character. So history has seen a lot of that. And so we're going to talk now about Jonathan, King Saul's son. Saul was the first king of Israel. Before that was all the judges. If you want to follow along, you don't really need to. I'm going to be just kind of, to save time, I'm not going to read many scriptures, but we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 14 is where this is about. And so this is fairly early on in the kingdom. Saul had become king, anointed king. Different things were happening. One thing that happened that was a real challenge to Israel and to Saul. The Philistines that had taken up control over the coastal cities and area had come in with great strength. They invaded, and they basically were taking control of Israel to a great degree. And they ruled that no blacksmith should be ever allowed to be in Israel anywhere, because they didn't want the Israelites developing swords and weapons. And so they said that the Israelites, for their farming tools like pruning sticks, hoes, would have to go to the Philistines to get things sharpened. because that's all the weapons of war they had. Can you imagine? Farming equipment, it was all the weapons of war they had. But they did have two swords, one by King Saul and one by his son Jonathan. So they had basically invaded, and they were sending out raiding parties. And it said they came in with 30,000 chariots. Those are like the tanks of the ancient time. They came in almost innumerable, and they had set up in the middle of the country at Michmash. And so they were being confronted with a tremendous threat, almost like in the time of Gideon, the years before. So anyway, the army, most of the people had fled. Saul, I think they had about 3,000 and soldiers with Saul and Jonathan. And one day, Jonathan goes exploring by himself with his armor bearer. And he goes a long distance from the camp. And he gets thinking, okay, there's a real deep gorge between me and the enemy camp over there, with all the thousands and thousands of enemy. But he said to his sword bearer, you know what? He said, God has the victory. God can win, whether by many or by few. You and me, we're few. Here's my intentions. I want to crawl down and crawl up the other side, and I want to attack them. And so he does that. And the armor bearer says, I'm with you. They crawl down, they crawl up the other side. And some of the Philistines said, hey, you stay right there. We're going to come to you. And as he starts coming to him, he takes his sword and he starts cutting down the enemy. And his armor bearer behind him is finishing them off. And he goes about half a furrow's length in an acre, it says. So he's working his way into the enemy camp. And God sends a tremendous earthquake. And the camp wakes up to the fact that there's some fighting going on, and they all go into a panic. And so in panic, they just start swinging their swords, and they start fighting one another, and the thousands, they just start running. Well, way down the line, Saul's army, they look and they go, hey, look at it. Something's going on at the enemy camp. There's fighting, they're running away. And Saul said, well, quick, take a number. Who's missing? And they go, it's your son Jonathan. And his armor bearer, they're missing. Well, then they go, he must be over there fighting them. So Saul decides to get real spiritual. He said, okay, I'm putting an oath on everybody. We're going to fast today and let no man eat anything today until we totally destroy the enemy. So then they say, okay, let's go get him. So they start following after the stragglers, and they start fighting them. They're chasing the Philistine army over the hills, back to the coast. They start fleeing into a forested area. And as they come into this area, they see honey all over the forest. I'm good, thanks. They see honey all over the forest. So Jonathan takes a staff, and he just fills up the tip of honey, and he takes a whole mouthful of honey. And honey is sugar, and it says his eyes brighten. He gets renewed with strength. And he says, and he looks at all the soldiers, and they're panting, they're weak, and they're tired. And he says, come on, guys, look what God has provided. Come on. They go, we can't. What do you mean you can't? Your father Saul has put us all under oath. We cannot eat anything today until the day's over and we've destroyed all the enemy. And if anybody breaks that oath, they're to be killed. And you've already taken this. So Saul comes up and he goes, what's the hold up here? And they go, we can't, we're wore out. And Jonathan says, my father, you just troubled Israel today. We could have had a fantastic You could have had a fantastic victory, but you put them all under this oath. You did a religious thing. No. And now we're not going to have a complete victory because of that. And so he said, well, you have to be killed. I'm sorry, I put the army under that oath, and you ate, and all the armies, no way, Jonathan is not dying today. Jonathan gave us a great victory, and so just forget that. And the army saves his life. What I see hidden in that message right there is legalisms and religiosity wear people out and bring death.
Amen.
It does not give you victory. Jonathan had a pure, simple faith. Isn't that an amazing thing, what he did? I mean, what a hero. Now, this was even before David and Goliath. But just think about that. David attacked a giant. And, we talked about that, 9-foot giant, big armored guy. I mean, it was totally powerful, heroic, wonderful thing. But Jonathan, by himself, attacked the whole army of thousands. He was a man of faith, a man of simple faith. And so, I believe the honey in the forest represents grace. And there's a verse that says, it's good to be strengthened by grace. I've had people come up to me over the years and say, Pastor, well, I've never heard people talk about grace like you do. I go, how can any Protestant church, how can people who have been in any Protestant church not have heard a lot about grace, But isn't grace wonderful? Simple faith and simple grace. Jonathan just extolled that. He just lived that. He was such an amazing man of faith. And that's just awesome. Later on, there becomes the story of David. David shows up. He's a young man, really young man, 15, 16 years old. We figured about that. And the whole army is withstanding because they're afraid of Goliath. And you know the story of David, right? He said, why are we fighting? God is with us. Get out there. So they said, well then, okay, go ahead. And he did. And that caused that whole army to flee when Goliath was killed. And they won a tremendous victory. And David got promoted in the eyes of all Israel as being a God-called man, an anointed man of God. As we read the story, you might not remember this verse, because I didn't really. As we read the story, what happens after the battle, the son of the king, Saul, comes up to David, and he just loves the guy. And they become soulmates. They become very best friends. And in fact, let me just read this. See if you ever remember this. This is what's in there. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as he loved his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe. Now wait a minute, what robe would he have? Wouldn't he have a royal robe? He was the prince. He stripped himself of the robe and put it on David, gave it to him, and he also gave him his armor, and he gave him his sword and his bow and his belt. He said, you can have all my stuff. And remember, there's only 2 swords in the country. And he gave him the sign of royalty, he gave him the royal armor, he gave him everything. But David and Jonathan were just the best friends with the best integrity. They were an amazing guys. But then Saul kept failing, and we know finally God said, I've just had enough. And it actually took place before this, I believe. Yeah, it took place before this. And he sent Samuel and said, I'm disappointed in you. You haven't obeyed me. You've always got a better idea. He sent the prophet Samuel to tell him he was going to remove him as king, and that his household would no longer rule in Israel. But he was looking after a man after his own heart. And he found him in this teenage boy out pasturing the sheep, shepherding the sheep. And that was David, right? So we know David also, David had an anointing. Prophet Samuel went to Jesse's family, and the youngest one, he anointed David to be king. But that didn't make him king. He had to prove himself yet, and then later on when we have the story of Goliath. But David keeps just being a firebrand. He was a go-getter. He was anointed by God. He was winning the victories. He became a commander in the army. But then, you know what happened is Saul started getting jealous. Saul started getting jealous of David. And he started developing a hatred, and I'm sure, and I think the Bible shows, he started knowing, well, he's going to supplant me, but you know, he'll also take the throne away from my son Jonathan as well. So he wanted to eliminate David. And we know the stories of that. At first, just while David was around, he would try to doing different things to kill him. God always had him escape. Finally, David had to flee out into the desert, into the caves. And the whole army of Israel is searching for him and trying to find him. This put his best friend, Jonathan, the king's son, in a very difficult position, right? Very difficult position, because now he was caught between loyalty to his father, who is not only his father that he's supposed to honor and help, but he's also the king. So he's also supposed to obey the king. But on the other hand, he's made a covenant, and he's a sole brother to David. So he's caught in a very difficult position. How is he going to play that out? So what Jonathan does, he honors his father, but he knows it's morally not right to kill a hero of Israel. He knows David has not done anything wrong, so he's going to try to also protect David. And they work out some clues and methods of Jonathan, in essence, becomes a spy in the castle, with the king, and keeps sending messages and different kinds of coding they're working out so that David will be protected and know when and where to flee. And so here is a verse. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David and strengthened his hand in God. Isn't that neat? He strengthened. What does that mean? He strengthened David by his hand in God. He built up his faith. He talked to him. He encouraged him. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next with you. I shall be next to you. Saul my father knows this." And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Jonathan knew he had every right to be king. He was the prince, right? And he had to work between his loyalty to father and king and his friend. But what to me is even more amazing, he recognized God's calling on him. How many people in history, how many people in our time, in our businesses, would say, "You know what? I realize you are to be the one in my place." He could have just let his king, his father, kill him off so he could be king, he could rule and reign in Israel, right? He could have done that, but what did he do? He had the integrity, not only integrity, But I believe he had submissiveness to the will of God, right?
Yeah.
He was submissive to the will of God. Because sometimes we might want to do something, but we can know in our knower, especially if we have a faith, if we have integrity to God, we will see that that's not to be my position. This is the man for it. And Jonathan did that. He submitted himself to the will of God. He did not try to usurp David. He did not himself try to usurp him. If he was so close, he could have acted like a friend and then stabbed him. How many cases in history have there been like that? Ye too, Brutus, you know? So there's been a lot of cases of that, but he had a fantastic integrity. He had fantastic faith. He had fantastic submission to whatever God wants. And he yielded to not let David be usurped, to be undermined, to be killed. And he just tells David, here, you are to be king. Here's my armor, here's my loyalty, here's my oath, and I submit to you, I'll be under you. Isn't that amazing? What an amazing character. Now, the thing with Jonathan too, he didn't just have birthright to the king, but he had the character to be king, right? He had the character, and he was a faith hero. He was also a great hero of faith in Israel. But God had said, no, Saul, your lineage, your family will not rule because you so offended me. But Jonathan submitted to that, and he tried to walk in integrity between Father King and his best friend, David. So he was supposed to respect his father. He was also had a covenant, was to be a true friend. His motive could have gone any way, right? Anybody's motive, you know, motives can so trick us up and betray us. Is our motive to really do the will of God? I think Jonathan will have a very high place in heaven. I mean, he's such a character, a hero of faith, a hero of integrity, a hero of submissiveness to the will of God. By recognizing it was God doing it. Instead of fighting it, he was supporting it. Too bad his father wasn't like that. And he manages to keep loyalty to both. And I remember standing on Mount Precipice in Israel, looking over the Jezreel Valley. And I see the mountains across the valley, there's one behind that. And I asked our guide, I said, is that Mount Gilboa where Saul and Jonathan were killed? He goes, yes. Jonathan was loyal to the end. He paid a price, you know. But he was loyal. He was an epitome of loyalty. How important is character in our lives and to God? But isn't that an amazing story about Jonathan? With an outstanding character. He had integrity, he had righteousness, he had faith. And that's what we need to pray for that kind of transformation in our nation for the Bible. So be it, Lord.